do a little bit of introduction about our speakers, our next speakers. So we have, as we all know, Fire Smart landscaping has become a really large focus for both UCCE and Marin Master Gardeners. So last year, UC Cooperative Extension hired Sophia Porter, who you might have seen, to fill the role of Fire Smart landscaping science and education specialist to meet the growing need for disseminating information to the public about this important issue. And then fellow Marin Master Gardeners, Jim Kasper, who's the class of 2010, and Bob Maselli, class of 2014, work closely with Sophia and others in the county to help educate residents about the importance of Fire Smart landscaping and creating defensible spaces around our homes. They've developed a really informative and helpful presentation, kind of scary, as we all think about what we're going to do to our homes to be fire safe, but they're now going to share it with us. Jim's gardening area of interest is California natives, with particular attention to garden planning and plant selection for fire risk area mitigation defensible space. So I think this was prompted because he said in his bio that after a 12-acre fire erupted on forested public land about a quarter of a mile from his home, he decided, this is something I really want to pay attention to. So he looks at native plants and fire risk mitigation. He's worked with various organizations like the GGNRA, Marin County Parks, Marin Master Gardeners, and the fire agencies in Marin County, and the Marin chapter of the California Native Plant Society. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and back off and let them lead the show. And you all have 2 hours to divide amongst yourselves.
Thank you, Carol. Okay, Fire Smart landscaping. I guess I'm gonna temper a little bit of what Carol said about being afraid. Hopefully, what you're going to hear is that there's a lot of things you can do in your yard and around your house to make your yard fire smart. And hopefully, between what Bob and myself present, dispel maybe some nasty myths and rumors about how much work it really is going to take. A lot of it's going to involve primarily focusing on maintenance, a little bit about plant placement, and frankly, not an awful lot about specific plants as it relates to being fire smart. However, the emphasis will be on, if you're going to be selecting plants and looking at replacements, to definitely consider natives, California natives, primarily because there's a lot of other beneficial reasons, some of which, frankly, I think Stephen talked about, deeper root systems, more tolerant to drought conditions and so on. So, I'm going to hopefully present a more positive view than maybe what you may be thinking of regarding Fire Smart landscaping. So I'm going to be covering what I'm going to call the theory, which is just some background and principles, talk a little bit about plant selection. That's what people may think is going to be key, and hopefully it'll show that that's not as important as some other factors. Talk about a little bit about defensible space zones, what's important, where to look for doing work first. A little bit on watering considerations. We'll talk, like Stephen did, about some drought considerations, although after what we've gone through over the last 2 or 3 months, you wonder why we would do that. Then Bob will basically cover what I call the practice, which is a working process, which is his own yard. And he'll give you some background on how it started and when he first moved here, and what he's been doing and what he's going to continue to do. The emphasis is that a fire smart landscape is really a healthy landscape in a number of ways. It's hopefully got some water consideration characteristics, obviously fire characteristics, hopefully some characteristics that apply to pollinators and general ecological benefits. So it's really got a number of things. I also want to emphasize that unlike thinking about for example, a cottage garden or an English garden, it's really not an aesthetic. Like being drought tolerant, being fire smart doesn't necessarily mean that you've got a particular, platform of plants or what you're going to plant. Any yard can be fire smart. So why is this important? I haven't attended all the sessions that you all have participated in, but I'll mention a couple things. For CAL FIRE, the state California Fire Department, Just as background, they keep track of large fires in various categories of characteristics. 5 of the top 10 most destructive fires have occurred in the last 5 years. 19 of the top 20 have occurred this century, since the year 2000. For the largest fires, 7 out of the top 10 in the last 5 years. Again, 19 out of 20 this century. The good news is that from a deadliest point of view, things have gotten much better. There's only about 3 or 4 that have occurred in this century. So the ability of the fire agencies to respond to conditions and save individuals, as well as what the individuals can do, has made a big difference. The expectation is that 2023, it's really uncertain at this point. There's arguments that would say because of the amount of water that we've gotten, plants will grow much more vigorously. And depending on what the heat would be like later in the year, it could create very high fire concerns later in the year. On the other hand, with proper maintenance, that could be ameliorated. I mentioned this presentation was actually done in part last year. If you add the conditions of severe drought and the conditions that we had in 2022, what you really end up with is what I'm calling weather whiplash. You go from the drought conditions last year, which was the focus of a lot of the presentations that were given, to now a situation where you've got heavy water use or heavy water rainfall. So some background. These are 2 triangles that often people will talk about just as reference from a fire point of view. You've got 3 components that are really important for fire to take place, which is oxygen, heat, and fuel. From a wildfire point of view, from the fire agencies, you likewise have 3 components, but in this case, it's topography, aspect, slope, and so on. It's the weather, and again, it's fuel. So when you're looking at the home environment, what is that fuel? First thing that people think about is the first item on that list, which is vegetation. But the reality is, it involves a lot of other things. It could be your landscape mulch. It could be the furniture and materials that you have stored on your deck. It's clearly the structure in the deck itself. And it's things that are attached to the structure, whether it's fencing, it's the roof, and so on. So you really have to look at the whole gamut of what can be affected. And when you're looking at fires in the wildland area, wildland fires, there are basically 3 ways that fire exposures take place for properties. Direct flame contact, which is exposure directly to something that's burning nearby the structure. Radiant heat, which is a situation where a nearby fire is so intense that it actually could cause something 5, 10, 15 feet away to catch on fire simply because of the intensity of the flames. And then finally, embers. What's typically happened, well, let me go back to embers for a minute. Basically, it's the ember storms that you probably heard about that can take place in a fire that could be up to a mile or 2 miles away. And based on the winds, cast embers, which are anything from a small piece of something no bigger than the size of your thumbnail or fingernail to a larger item. Could be part of a tree, it could be part of another structure that lands someplace and it hits some material that's combustible. And just because of that ember smoldering, it actually causes that other material to catch on fire. If that material is near the house or the structure, then in turn the structure has a risk of catching on fire. What has typically been the case is that people picture the direct flame issue as being the problem, when in reality, especially with the fires that have occurred over the last 15 or 20 years and the studies that have taken place, has shown that 60 to 90% of the structures that have burned are actually caused by embers. So it's not the direct flame contact, it's not the radiant heat that's the issue. It's really figuring out what you do around your property to minimize the risk of those ember storms causing things to catch fire on your property, which in turn may cause your structures to catch on fire. So let me just show you a couple scenarios. You've got this picture on the left, which is essentially the vegetation around this house has been totally burned. The house is perfectly fine. And then you have an alternative, and you've probably seen some of these pictures where it's just the opposite. The structure is caught on fire and they actually burned down completely, yet the vegetation is still standing. And the big difference is the kind of preparations that's taken place around each of those structures. So really, what you want to focus on is planning for the fire smart landscaping and figuring out how do you tackle what's going on in the property around your structures. Some basic principles are listed here. And frankly, if you look at this stuff and this list and you apply it to your property, this is pretty much the list that you would need to take care of having your property become more fire smart. But it's looking at all the plants and the landscape, making sure they're selected and placed properly, and importantly, maintained and hydrated appropriately. The landscape should be designed for ease of maintenance, and we'll talk a little bit about things that you can do to make that happen. Your home and landscape is unique, so you need to look at the characteristics that are specific based on this, are you in a flat area, slope? What's the aspect in terms of sun exposure and so on? How close are your neighbors? Keep in mind what is required by law. And frankly, there is relatively little that's specifically required by law. However, the fire agencies do have the ability to apply requirements to make sure that your property is fire safe and fire smart. And use the science to inform the decisions of what's most important for you to take action on. So 2 examples, just for comparison. On the picture on the left, a lot of issues that are of concern, and it shows the kinds of situations where a structure is exposed to embers and something near the structure essentially causing a problem with the structure. Whether it's continuous vegetation, the fire could start here in the bottom left and run through this vegetation into the tree and then ultimately touching and exposing the house to direct flame contact. You could have debris and material around the base of the foundation. Embers again could catch any of that on fire and cause the house to catch on fire itself. The picture on the right basically shows the same scenario, however, with the appropriate work done to maintain the property. Appropriate spacing, gaps between vegetation, clean area around the house, the roof and other parts of the home are kept clean of any debris. One of the key points is to eliminate what are called fuel ladders. You probably heard about this, and basically it's the scenario on the right where you have flames that may have started a distance away from the house, catches the grass on fire. The grass in turn the fire moves along the grass, catches some shrubbery on fire because of the exposure of the shrubs. Maybe they're right up against the ground. The tops of those shrubs are touching or into the canopy of a tree. When those shrubs catch on fire, the tree catches on fire. What you want to keep in mind is that in general, you have about 6 feet or more of removal of lower limbs and branches on the tree to minimize the risk of any fire at the ground catching into the tree. If you do have any shrubs or plants underneath the tree, one of the points to keep in mind is that if a plant is a certain height, let's say it's 2 feet tall, flames could be, if that plant catches on fire, flames from that plant could be up to 3 times above that plant. So the flames in this case, where the plant is at the top is 2 feet above ground, flames could actually go up to 8 feet up. So you may want to limb that tree much higher than just the 6 feet recommendation. So it's really important to keep the fire from moving from the ground into the trees and moving quickly along the ground. So you're doing both vertical and horizontal spacing. If you're on a slope, Depending on the slope, what you want to do is have spacing be greater than what would be true on the flat area. Fire tends to preheat material that's upslope of it, and that's the reason why that distance keeps on increasing, both for shrubbery as well as for trees. In a lot of these diagrams, one of the things I want to emphasize is that you may see things that talk about individual plants. What you will see later in the presentation is we're really going to be talking about plant grouping. So we're not talking about big spaces between one plant here and another plant there. It's really the groupings of the plants and the spacing between those groupings that's going to be important. The other factor that's important from a fire agency point of view and fire risk mitigation is looking at defensible space and how do you approach what's going on in your property. Well, what is defensible space? It's basically providing an area around your structures, and it's more than a house. It could be a detached garage or an outbuilding of some form, but to reduce the flammability of the vegetation near that structure. You're doing it in such a way that if a fire is approaching at the ground, there are gaps in the vegetation that slow down the pace of that fire movement. Likewise, there's a non-combustible material so that if there are any ember storms, there's a low chance of those embers catching some material, debris, for example, up against the structure that would cause the structure to catch on fire. The focus is to do the work closest to the structure first and then work your way out and having more flexibility of what you can do as you get farther away from the structure. What's important is to keep in mind it's referred to as defensible space in part because it's really an area that if there is a fire nearby and threatening your house, it's a place where the firefighters can safely take action to try to save the house. So you're really giving all the firefighters places to do their work and be able to save your property. So I mentioned it before, you really want to start at your house and work on the way out. There are a number of suggestions of what you can do for the structure itself. Fire Safe Marin has all that information because it's not gardening. We're not going to go into that, but we will start at the sides of the house. And the first area is that first 5 feet. And I want to mention here, and you may have heard about this, is that there was a law passed in 2020 that is scheduled to take effect the beginning of next year for new structures and the beginning of 2025 for existing structures, that you need to have that first 5 feet containing non-combustible material. What exactly that means in terms of guidance is still being worked on by the Board of Forestry and at the state level. So it hasn't been totally defined. I will tell you that some insurance companies consider non-combustible to be a very strict definition. That is, it's stone, it's material that is not at all going to burn. That may not affect your ability to get insurance, but it may affect your ability to get a discount on insurance. It's not, again, I want to emphasize, it's not clear exactly what those guidelines will be given at the state level, which will eventually come down to the local fire agencies. So you want to start there to look at minimizing the risk of embers catching some debris on fire that's next to the structure and therefore catching the structure on fire. Then you want to look at the next 30 feet, or I'm sorry, the next 25 feet going out to 30 feet. And there were studies that were done and some tests in some large forest areas in the mid-90s. It basically showed that if you've got for example, a plywood platform, or a plywood wall at the 30-foot level, even if it's a very significant forest fire, that will not catch on fire just through radiant heat. So that's the background behind the 30-foot measure. And then go out to 100 feet or to your property line from that point on. And what you're doing is putting more plants of different kinds and different heights as you get farther away from the house. And we'll talk a little bit about it as we go through the presentation. So what do you need to do in terms of design and basic maintenance? Really, the key point is to make sure that all dead and dying plants and branches are cleared and that you remove all of the ladder fuel situations that may exist on your property. I mentioned before, we're going to talk more about islands of plants. And the idea is that you have a group of plantings with some non-combustible paths around it. That minimizes the risk of if that one island catches on fire, that the fire would spread to any adjacent plantings. One way I look at it, and I don't know if you've gone through the presentations on edibles and raised beds, but if you take the idea of a raised bed for edibles, you're planting things in such a way that you can always get at the vegetables that are in that raised bed. I look at the islands as having a similar situation. You want to be able to get access to all of the plants in that island from around the paths that surround that island. Avoid plants or mulch close to all structures. If it's going to be mulch right up against the house, you probably should look at something that's non-combustible. And as I mentioned before, pruning tree limbs up at least 6 feet, or if it's a young and shorter tree, 1/3 of the tree height. The challenge in the garden is that unlike a structure, the plants are going to continually change. So you really want to understand that for the plants you have, how large will it grow, both in terms of height and width. In reality, will it thrive? This gets back to one of the basic master gardener principles, which is the right plant in the right place. So you're understanding all the various characteristics of what the plant needs, and is that location appropriate? Will you be able to maintain it, both now and in the future? Is it a plant that's invasive? Will it spread? And maybe in some cases, that's something you would like to have. There's several California natives that are like that. If you've got open space and you're able to deal with that, that may be okay. But on the other hand, it really says you've got to watch out and be able to maintain that plant. And consider how it changes over the lifespan of the plant. Some plants have longer lifespans and can be, grows less quickly and can be maintained more easily. And we'll talk about maintenance schedules in a little bit. So let's talk about the 0 to 5 feet from the structure. At a minimum, you want to make sure there are minimal plantings within that area. Bob will talk about some of the things he's done in his property. Especially, you want to make sure that there's no plantings underneath vents and eaves, in front of windows, or any combustible siding. Also, not under or near any decks. What you're trying to prevent is that plant in a location like that from catching on fire and in essence causing the fire to spread to the structure. In the case of windows or sidings, it could, especially in the case of windows, it could cause the window to break and embers to get inside the structure, even though the structure from the outside doesn't burn. Mentioned the decorative rock and enhanced hardscapes. I'll show some examples in a little bit of what you can use. Again, trying to just keep that area clean. One of the requirements is that all trees, and this is in the code, all tree limbs be pushed back at least 10 feet from any chimneys. The recommendation is, in fact, to do that for even the sidings and the roof of the house. So what kind of materials to consider in that 0 to 5 feet? These are just some examples. The top list is the stuff that's clearly going to be possible to use within the 0 to 5 feet, depending on what the final code will be from the State Department of Forestry. It may allow succulents, low-growing plants, perhaps even some grasses. But again, that's going to be a matter of sort of watch this space over the next couple of months. One consideration, if you have fencing that attaches to the house, is make sure that there is no wooden fencing that's attached to the house that may actually become part of the requirement, the 0 to 5 feet. There's a couple ways to approach that. One is, in some of the examples that are shown here, is that you have essentially non-combustible material in the fencing in all locations. One alternative, if you have wooden fencing in most places, is replace, as in shown in this area, the lower picture on the left, replace that last 3 to 5 feet of the fencing with something that is non-combustible. It could be a grid material like is shown here. It could be a metal fence. One of the other solutions is hardy board, which is a cement composite that's also used for siding, but that's been recommended as a possible section that you could put into for a wooden fence that attaches to a structure. So you may think, well, why does this matter? I mean, is it really that important for 0 to 5 feet? Well, here's an example of where it does matter. What you have is a house where you had a fire at quite a distance. Clearly, the lawn has not burned. Yet all of the shrubs in the up against the house have caught fire. Any of the mulch has burned. Probably is where the embers landed. That in turn causes plants to catch on fire. And if you look closely at the picture, what you have is melted siding on the side of the house. Fortunately, nothing severe enough that would have either broken the window to cause the embers to catch and go inside, or for the actual siding to totally start burning, and then the whole structure burning. When you go beyond that 5 feet, what's referred to as the home defense zone, plant in islands, non-combustible paths in between those islands. The picture is an example of what you can do. Height is less of an issue. The preference would be to probably keep your plants under 3 feet. But if you've got a larger island and you've got a taller plant in the middle, that should be fine. Trees are okay. I'll talk a little bit about some of the myths. This is not, even in this area, it's not a matter of removing trees because of a threat. The reality is that tree, if properly maintained, is not going to be a threat to the house. As mentioned before, keep all plants accessible for maintenance, and hardscaping and the spacing between islands is going to be exceptionally important. Perennials are probably the best, and just from a maintenance point of view, but interspersed with annuals would be appropriate. Well-maintained is important. Hydration is important. I know Stephen Swain talked about different hydrozones. One of the considerations you might have is integrate some kind of hydrozoning for your landscape based on the distance from the house. And that could make a big difference, so that if you do need to water, you're watering those plants that are closest to the house if there's especially dry situation. When you get beyond the 30-foot distance, you probably have an opportunity for wider walkways. Again, maintaining material to keep the area clean. You can keep your grass. You could have lawns in that area without a problem. Tall grasses, especially some of the native grasses. A consideration is look at the escape routes from your house out to the street or out to your car. You want to make sure that that pathway, that walkway, whatever it is, stairway, doesn't have a lot of plant material near it, because if there is a significant ember storm and any of that material catches on fire, you want to be able to get yourself through on that walkway, on the stairway, out to your car. Here's a couple examples of what you can do in some of the plantings. Keep in mind that the idea of having some kind of a break on your property doesn't have to be just horizontal. It could be a vertical wall, as shown here. That could, if a fire was approaching this area at the ground level, with proper maintenance, it could end up stopping at that vertical stone wall. I mentioned the route to your vehicles. Uh, just keep in mind the health and condition of the plants along the way, and maintenance is extremely important. Mulch is a question that always comes up, both from a garden and plant health point of view, but also in terms of from a fire safety point of view. You want to have non-combustible mulch, and that's 0 to 5 feet. As I mentioned, that may soon become a requirement. The exact specifics are to be determined. In that 5 to 30-foot distance from the house, separate any, if you have used composted wood chips or larger wood chips, but then separate those areas with non-combustible material. More leeway as you get beyond 30 feet in terms of the mulch that you use. And one of the key points is to not use gorilla hair anywhere on the property. There have been reports that the firefighters can end up having to dig through that material because it smolders quite a bit in an ember storm, and can basically have the fires stick around by smoldering, and may spread even after the firefighters leave an area that they think is safe. 2 to 3 inches is probably the most you want to look at. One of the recommendations I've heard of is, if you do the mulch in the late fall, early winter time period, that mulch will deteriorate over the winter and can help not only retain water as you go through the summer, but also be more combustion resistant in the future. Stain mulch can be a problem for a period of time because that stain material could actually be volatile and catch on fire. Here are some defensible space myths. These are covered in part on some videos at Fire Safe Marin. The key point is that there's very little that you cannot do when you're planning your landscape. You can keep the trees, you can keep most of the vegetation. It's really a matter of maintaining what you have. And if you're going to do any new planting, do the appropriate planting. And to me, one of the biggest myths is that people think they've got to do it all now. It's really a matter of prioritizing what you want to do and what you need to do over a period of time. And the time could be over not only days, weeks, but also years. One of the questions that always comes up is, what about fire-resistant plants? The reality is, and the official guidance is that there are no such things. All plants will burn. And I'll just give you an example. There was a study that was done in Florida, and they actually identified 4 characteristics of what would cause a plant to burn. And they started off with ignitability, how quickly will it catch on fire, combustibility, how fast will that fire spread in the plant, sustainability, will it continue for a long period of time, and then how much of the plant is consumed. Well, if you look at just those 4 factors, trying to figure out whether the plant is fire resistant, it would be very difficult. Now add to that characteristics like, has it been watered? What else is around it? How well has it been maintained? What time of the year is it? And it becomes very difficult to say that you can identify a fire-resistant plant. So start off by realizing that there is no such thing, and it's really a matter of placement and maintenance that's going to be important. Some of the desirable characteristics, whether it's woody or herbaceous, is fine. Mature plants, size appropriate, make sure it's appropriate for the particular defensible space zone, that you can maintain it. You understand its moisture needs and its retention, of the ability to retain moisture, and how much it might reproduce or spread. Our recommendation is that Mediterranean plants are generally better because of the environment we're in. And in fact, California natives are probably often more appropriate. And Bob will talk a little bit more about that. Primarily because they're adapted to our local soil and climate, as well as all the critters and creatures around us. And often they're water-wise and drought tolerant, in part because of their growth characteristics and their adaptation to this environment. I just briefly mentioned people say, well, how can I do all this and also save water if we end up with a drought or we want to worry about water management in the future? There are steps you can take in that case in the future. I'm not going to go through these. It's sort of not appropriate right now, given the recent rains. But you can establish your priorities and adjust your watering practices appropriately based on the conditions that exist. And mulch is probably extremely important to make sure you've got proper water retention. Well, if you want to really put in new plants, really consider a number of factors, many of which I've mentioned already, which is placement and maintenance and its growth pattern and the water needs of the plant. I would also say what you also want to look at is the biodiversity benefits and general ecological benefits of the plant as well when you're doing your selection. And fall, or even at this point in time, is the right time to plant and the right time to determine the right place. You may get some pushback from fire agencies, or if you've had an inspection, they will have recommendations. Generally, they are not their recommendations and not something that you need to do immediately. Really look at understand the defensible space assessments that you do. Many of the fire agencies in Marin County are doing that, and we'll be starting that up in the next couple of months. The specific fire code is called Public Resource Code 4291. Each fire agency has that. I mentioned that zone 0, that 0 to 5 feet. That update should be coming out the specifics update is coming out fairly soon. And look at plant lists. There are some places that do list some good plants and bad plants, but this is from a fire agency point of view, not necessarily anything that makes a difference from a master gardener point of view. Just keep in mind that it's really, as you've heard in the past, right plant in the right place. And I would just add, Bob and I would add that it's also the right care for what you do. So if you want to do something, question is, what do you want? What should you do now? My recommendation would be, with a morning coffee or an afternoon drink, take a walk around your property and just take notes. Emphasize looking at what's in that areas closest to your house and your structures, things that you think should change. Start by just simply doing some cleanup within the 0 to 5 feet. It's relatively easy work. It doesn't necessarily cost anything. Make use of your green bin to take care of disposing of any of that material. Look at plans for your next steps. As you may know, the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority in Marin County is sponsoring chipper days, and they're going to be starting fairly soon. You can schedule your work to match the chipper day so that material gets hauled away if you've got some significant amount of material. Also work with your neighbors to coordinate and cooperate the work. So it's not just a great fire smart landscape on your property, but it really applies to your entire neighborhood. And I think probably the more important thing is just to take it easy, make a plan, and work on it methodically. So we believe that you can have a fire smart and sustainable landscape and does have the characteristics of other things like being drought tolerant. Start at your house and work out, and maintenance is essential. And I just want to leave this picture at the end. This shows an example of work that somebody did. The picture on the left is the way the property looked originally, with wooden stairways, a lot of concerns about what's up against the house, basically redirected some of the paths. I want to emphasize the work that was done here was not done because of any kind of fire requirements. There were problems in this upper area that the homeowners wanted to take care of. And as a real result of that, basically said, hey, we're going to just do a redesign and implemented this. I think it's made a significant difference in terms of the way the property looked. added some interesting foliage, and I think made a much nicer presentation for the property. So with that, I'm going to stop share and turn it over so Bob can take over from here.
Any questions?
I'm going to check and see if we have any questions first, if you wouldn't mind.
No problem.
Okay.
There is one question.
Yeah, so Peggy was asking, is compost considered a non-combustible mulch?
The answer is yes. One of the, I think one of the slides that talked about composted mulch. Basically, there's actually a mulch study. There's a handout that I put together, Carol, for the class to look at. I think that was distributed for them. There's a mulch study that was done about 10 years ago. That's going to be updated soon. That looked at different mulches. They talk about composted mulch, which essentially, think of it as what I call chunky mulch, or chunky compost. So it's got dirt aspects, but it has large pieces of material, but it's all been deteriorated to the point where it's the chance of it catching on fire is low.
Great, thank you. I think that was our only question. Okay.